The town remembers the wedding for one reason. She stood a full head taller than the groom, and he leaned on a cane to reach the altar. Folks whispered that she'd married a man who couldn't lift a feed sack. They were wrong about everything. By August, the strongest farmers in the valley would be standing at his fence, hats in hand, begging to learn. Margaret Vane came to the Nebraska prairie in the spring of 1874 with two trunks and a husband most of Halford County had already written off. Caleb was thin as a fence rail, shorter than she was, and walked with a limp from a wagon accident years before. On their first evening, surveying the dry quarter section, he said quietly, "Land doesn't reward the strongest, Margaret. It rewards whoever listens to it." She didn't understand him yet. She would. The whole town would before the year was out. The homestead sat at the western edge of Halford, where the prairie tilted gently toward a draw lined with cottonwoods. The previous claimant had abandoned it after two failed seasons, and the reasons were plain. The soil was good, but the water was stingy. A single spring seeped from the base of a low rise behind the house, producing a thread of water that pooled and vanished into the grass before it could do any good. Margaret had grown up on a farm in Ohio and knew the weight of real work. She could split wood, drive a team, and mend a roof. When she'd married Caleb back east, a man she'd met when he repaired clocks and surveying instruments in her uncle's shop, the women in her family had pursed their lips. He was clever, yes, but clever did not break sod. Clever did not survive a prairie winter. Their nearest neighbor, Dorsey Puit, owned the mercantile in town and half the mortgages besides. He was a broad, confident man who farmed a large spread north of theirs with hired hands and loud opinions. Pruitt had wanted the Vane quarter section for himself to round out his holdings, and he had assumed it would fall back into his hands within a year. He greeted their arrival with the warmth of a man watching a clock he intended to inherit. "You'll want to dig deep," Pruitt told Caleb on their second day, gesturing across the land with a thick arm, down to the water table. "Every man worth his salt out here digs deep. Trenches, wells, the works. Course." His eyes traveled over Caleb's slight frame and the cane. "That takes a back. You got a back for it, friend." Caleb only smiled and said he'd think on it. That night, by lamplight, he spread a sheet of paper across the table and began to draw. Not a well, not a trench. He drew the land itself, the rise, the draw, the slope falling away toward the cottonwoods. He marked the spring. He marked, in careful figures, the inches the land dropped over every 100 feet. "What are you doing?" Margaret asked. "Listening," he said. She watched the lamplight move on his thin face and felt, underneath her worry, a small flickering trust. She had married him for the way his mind worked, even when she couldn't follow it. Outside, the wind moved over a quarter section of dry grass, and somewhere behind the house, the little spring went on giving its thread of water to nothing at all. In June, the rains failed. They had been thin all spring, and now they stopped entirely. Across Halford County, the corn began to curl at the edges, leaves rolling tight against the heat like fists. Men who had dug deep wells found the water table had dropped beyond their reach, and the trenches they'd cut to channel runoff held nothing but cracked mud. Pruitt rode through the valley like a general inspecting a losing campaign, and at the mercantile he extended credit at terms that tightened around a family's throat. Margaret heard the talk when she went for flour. 3 homesteads were already behind. 2 more were close. She came home with the flour and the news and found Caleb out behind the house, kneeling at the spring with a wooden level and a length of string, perfectly calm, as though the drought were simply a question he had been waiting all his life to answer. "We should dig," Margaret said that night. "Everyone's digging. Maybe they're right and we're wrong. Maybe I should hire out my labor to Pruitt for the season, earn cash money while you—" She stopped, not wanting to finish the sentence in a way that wounded him. "While I do what I can't," Caleb finished for her, without bitterness. "It's all right. Say it plainly. I didn't mean that. You meant we have one strong back between us and it isn't mine." He set down his pencil. "You're right. I can't dig a 40-foot well. I couldn't dig a 4-foot trench without resting every quarter hour. If the answer to this land is muscle, then we've already lost, and you should take Pruitt's wages. Margaret sat down across from him. The lamp guttered in a draught. Then what is the answer? Water doesn't need to be lifted, he said. It needs to be guided. The spring gives us maybe 2 barrels a day. It's not much, but 2 barrels a day, every day, delivered exactly where it's needed and never wasted. That's more than enough for a garden, an orchard, and stock if nothing is squandered. He turned the paper toward her. The land here drops 11 inches every 100 feet from the spring toward the draw. Water wants to go downhill, so we don't fight it. We make it go downhill slowly, along the paths we choose, and we give it to the roots one cupful at a time, instead of throwing it on the surface where the sun steals it back. With what? We can't afford pipe. We can't afford anything. Split logs. There's a stand of straight cottonwood and a fallen pine in the draw. Split a log, hollow the half, and you've got a flume. Clay from the creek bank for the channels and the joints. Those 4 old barrels in the barn set at heights to hold water and let it settle and feed the lines steadily. Canvas. We've got the old wagon cover, stretched and waxed to carry water across the low spot without it sinking in. His thin finger traced the lines. It's slow work, but it's work I can do. A little every day. Splitting, hollowing, fitting, sealing. I don't need a strong back for that. I need a level, patience, and you to trust me through a summer of people laughing. Margaret looked at the drawing for a long time. It looked less like a farm plan than like the veins of a leaf, everything branching from the one small source. They will laugh, she said. Let them. Laughing doesn't grow corn either. She drew a breath. All right, she said. We don't dig. We listen. They began the next morning at first light. Caleb marked the master line with stakes and string, checking each against the level, while Margaret carried the first split log up from the draw on her shoulder. He showed her how to read the bubble, how to set a fall of 1 inch over 12 feet, gentle enough that the water would walk, not run. By noon, they had the first flume laid from the spring to the highest barrel, and water, real water, clean and patient, began to trickle along the hollowed log and drip into the waiting wood. It was a thread, still, but it was a thread going somewhere now by design. Margaret stood back, sweat on her brow, and watched it run. For the first time, she let herself believe. Their nearest help came from an unlikely quarter. Old Henrietta Bowl farmed the adjoining claim alone, a widow of 70, with a face like a walnut and a memory longer than the county records. She wandered over the third day, leaning on her own stick, and watched Caleb work without a word for an hour. My husband tried something like this, she finally said. Out in the dry country. Folks called him a fool, too. She nodded at the flume. He used to say the same thing you're doing says, don't push the water, court it. She studied Caleb. You court it right, young man, and it'll never leave you. The system grew through July the way a vine grows, slowly, then all at once, branching and reaching, until one morning Margaret looked up from her work and could not quite believe what their hands had made. The split log flumes came first. Caleb had a method now refined over the first dozen attempts. He would select a cottonwood log of the right diameter, and Margaret would help him roll it onto the trestles he'd built at sitting height so he could work without standing. Then, with an adze and a curved gouge, he hollowed the half log into a smooth trough, taking his time, resting when his leg ached, working again. Each flume was a small act of patience. He fitted them end to end down the master line. Packing the joints with creek clay worked until it was smooth as butter, and where one flume met the next, he carved a little lip so the water passed without splashing. The barrels were the heart of it. He set the 4 old barrels at descending heights along the slope, each one fed by the flume above and feeding the flume below. Water rose into the first barrel, settled, let its sediment drop, then spilled clean from a notch near the top into the next line. The barrels did something Margaret only understood when she saw it work. They steadied the flow. The spring did not give water evenly through the day. It surged a little in the cool morning and slowed in the heat, but the barrels held a reserve, so the lines below ran at a constant, unhurried pace no matter what the spring was doing. Caleb called them his patience tanks. From the lowest barrel the water divided. This was the part that made Henrietta cackle with delight when she saw it. Kisp had split smaller branches and saplings into half-channels no wider than 2 fingers, and these threaded out among the vegetable rows like the fingers of a hand. Each row had its own little channel, and at the head of each he set a wooden gate, just a flat paddle of wood that slid in a slot. So they could open water to the beans while holding it, back from the squash, then close the beans and feed the onions. They watered each row in its turn, a few minutes at a time, and the water sank straight down to the roots instead of spreading and steaming away on the surface. "You see," he told Margaret, sliding a gate open and watching the dark line of wetness creep down a row of carrots. "The sun can't drink what it can't reach. Down here at the roots, it's ours." The orchard was harder because the 6 young fruit trees Margaret had nursed from whips sat on a low bench of ground that the slope wanted to skip over entirely. The water, left alone, would run past them toward the draw. This was where the canvas came in. Caleb cut the old wagon cover into strips, and Margaret stitched them into long troughs, which they stretched between forked stakes and waxed with a mixture Caleb cooked up from rendered tallow and pine pitch until the canvas shed water, like a duck's back. These canvas flumes carried water across the low spot, suspended in the air, sagging just enough to keep the fall true, delivering the spring's gift directly to a clay basin he'd shaped around the base of each tree. The trees drank. Within 2 weeks their leaves, which had been going pale, deepened to a glossy green that you could see from the road. That was the trouble, in a way. You could see it from the road. The first to stop was a farmer named Wills, whose own corn stood brown and rattling. He reined in his mule and stared over the fence at the Vane garden, green as a creek bottom in a county gone the color of a paper bag. "How?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "The spring," Caleb called back pleasantly, not pausing in his work. "That little seep? That couldn't water a window box." "It waters all of it," Caleb said. "Every day. We just don't waste any." Wills looked at the flumes and the barrels and the strange sagging ribbons of canvas, and his face worked through confusion into something close to scorn. "Looks like a child's whirligig," he said. "Sticks and string. You'll see. First real heat, that contraption'll dry up and soul you." He clucked to his mule and moved on, and Margaret felt the old familiar sting. But Caleb only slid another gate open, and the water walked obediently down the row, and the carrots drank and said nothing at all, because the carrots were his argument, and they were winning it leaf by leaf. Word traveled, as it does in a dry county where everyone is watching everyone else's fields, with the close attention of the desperate. By the 3rd week of July, the Vane place had become a kind of show. Men found reasons to drive past on the section road. They slowed their wagons. Some laughed openly. Some went quiet in a way that was worse than laughing, because it meant they were beginning to wonder. Puit came himself on a Thursday. He arrived in a buggy with brass fittings, his hired man driving, and he did not get down. He sat, looking over the fence at the garden, at the heavy heads of cabbage, the beans climbing their poles in green ropes, the carrot tops feathering thick and dark, the 6 fruit trees standing healthy on their bench while the whole rest of the valley curled and browned. "Quite a kitchen garden," Pruitt said. There was an edge under the pleasantness. "Pity it won't scale. A garden's one thing. A man can't feed a county off sticks and barrels." He smiled down at Caleb. "When that spring quits, and springs quit, friend, in a drought like this one, you'll be glad to know my door's open. I'm extending credit to good families all over this valley." Generous terms. "That's neighborly of you," Caleb said. "It is," Pruitt agreed, missing or ignoring the dryness. "You hold that note in mind." He nodded to his man, and the buggy rolled on, and Margaret watched it go with a cold feeling settling in her stomach, because she had begun to understand what Pruitt was. He was not waiting for them to fail by accident. He was waiting, and the waiting itself was a kind of pressure, and behind it stood every mortgage in the county. But the system held, more than held. It taught them. They learned its moods. They learned that in the worst heat of the afternoon they should close the upper gates entirely and let the barrels fill, then water everything in the cool of evening when the ground would hold the moisture through the night. They learned to skim the settling barrel so the lines wouldn't clog. Caleb kept a little book in which he recorded, in his clockmender's hand, how much the spring gave each day, and how much each crop took. And slowly the book filled with the private language of a man learning to speak with his land. Margaret found, to her own surprise, that she had stopped carrying the work alone. In Ohio, farm labor had been a thing of brute hours, dawn to dark, every muscle spent. Here the work was different. It was thought as much as sweat. She would split a log, and Caleb would shape it. She would set a stake, and he would sight the level. She would stitch the canvas, and he would wax it. Each of them did what they could do, and between them they were whole in a way she had not expected. She had married him for his mind. She was learning to love him for the way his mind made room for hers. "You're not what they think you are," she told him one evening, both of them sitting on the back step watching the last gate run. "What do they think I am? Half a man." Caleb laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him. "I am half a man by their measure. I'll never plow 40 acres. I'll never wrestle a bull or raise a barn alone." He gestured at the quiet, gleaming network spread across the slope, water threading through it like blood through a body. "But the land doesn't ask what I can lift. It asks whether I'm paying attention. And I am. I pay attention better than any strong man in this county because I've never had anything else to offer." He said it without self-pity, as a simple fact. Turns out attention is worth something out here. By the end of July, the difference between their quarter section and every field around it had become impossible to explain away as luck. Henrietta Ball, who had quietly let Caleb run one canvas line across their shared fence to feed her own tomatoes, was eating fresh vegetables while her neighbors lived on cornmeal and worry. She told everyone who would listen, and being 70 and afraid of no one, she told them loudly. "It's not a miracle," she would say. "It's arithmetic." The boy did arithmetic on the water, and the water minded him. Any of you could have done it if you'd stopped digging long enough to think. Most of them weren't ready to hear it, but a few were. And in a county where the corn was dying and a man at the mercantile was waiting with his open door and his generous terms, a few people beginning to think for themselves was the most dangerous thing in the world. To the man who profited from their not thinking. The turning came at the end of July at the county agricultural meeting in the Halford schoolhouse. Such meetings were usually grim affairs in a drought, but this one had an undercurrent. People kept glancing at Caleb, who sat near the back with Margaret, his cane across his knees. The schoolmaster who ran the meetings finally said it aloud. "Vane, your place is the only green ground between here and the river. Folks want to know how." The room turned. For a moment, Margaret felt every eye like a weight. Then Caleb stood, slight and plain among the big sunburned men, and instead of being ashamed, she felt something fierce rise in her chest. "It's no secret," Caleb said. "I'll tell anyone who wants to know. I'll show them, too. That offer, free, open, generous, was the thing Pruitt could not allow." He understood, as Caleb stood there in the schoolhouse, offering to teach the whole valley how to make a thin spring feed a farm, exactly what it would cost him. A county that learned to need less water needed less of Pruitt's credit. A county that learned it could think its way out of trouble needed less of Pruitt altogether. Every family that copied the Vane system was a family that might not sign his notes, might not mortgage the back 40, might not, in the lean years to come, slowly hand him their land one bad season at a time. So Pruitt did what such men do. He went to work on the thing quietly. It began with talk. At the mercantile, where everyone came eventually for flour and nails and news, Pruitt let drop his doubts. "Wasn't it strange?" he wondered aloud, that the vain place did so well when better farmers failed. Springs didn't just decide to run forever. And those barrels, old barrels, who knew what had been in them? Wasn't it a worry? Putting water that had been standing in old barrels onto food a family would eat. He'd heard of sickness from standing water. He wasn't saying anything for certain. He was just a careful man, looking out for his neighbors. The talk did its work. People are quick to find reasons to dismiss what they don't understand, and quicker still when dismissing it lets them off the hook for not having thought of it themselves. Some of the families who'd been on the edge of asking Caleb for help drew back. A standing water garden, they murmured, might be poison in it. Then came the matter of the water itself. Halford County, like much of the dry West, lived and occasionally died by the question of who owned the water. The spring rose on the vein quarter section, but the draw it drained toward crossed the corner of land Puit controlled, and the small creek in that draw eventually wound north through his big spread. Pruitt's lawyer, he kept one in the county seat, drew up a notice arguing that the spring's flow was part of the watershed feeding Pruitt's land downstream, and that by capturing and consuming the spring water with his barrels and flumes rather than letting it run its natural course, Caleb was unlawfully diverting water that belonged by prior use to Pruitt's herd. It was a thin argument. But thin arguments win when the man making them has money for lawyers and the man defending has none, and Pruitt knew it. The notice arrived on a hot, still morning, carried by the same hired man who drove the brass-fitted buggy. Margaret read it twice before she understood what it was reaching for. "He wants the spring," she said, her voice flat. "Not the water in it, the spring itself. He wants to make it illegal for us to touch our own water." Caleb took the paper and read it slowly. His face, which rarely showed much, went still in a way she had learned to read as the deepest kind of trouble. "He's saying the water was always going to flow down the draw to his creek," Caleb said, "and that by using it before it gets there, we're stealing it from him. By that logic, no man could ever use the water on his own land if it might, someday, somehow, trickle onto a richer man's. Can he win? In front of a judge who owes him money? In a county where he holds half the paper?" Caleb set the notice down. "He might. He's counting on us having no answer. He's counting on the same thing everyone's counted on since we got here. That I can't fight, because I'm not strong, and you can't fight alone." That evening, the water ran, as always had, walking gently down the flumes, filling the barrels, feeding the rows in the cool of the falling light, but it ran now under a shadow. Margaret stood at the lowest barrel with her hand in the cool spill of it and understood that the system her husband had built with patience and split logs was about to be tested by something patience alone could not turn aside. She did not yet see how a thin man with a cane and a clock mender's mind could possibly answer a rich man's lawyer. But she had stopped, somewhere in July, believing that strength was the only kind of force in the world. The hearing was set for the second week of August, before the county water commissioner in the seat at Halford. Pruitt, it was understood, had already spoken with the commissioner privately, as rich men do. The thing had the feel of a settled matter merely waiting to be performed. Caleb did not panic. He did something Margaret found almost unbearable to watch, because it looked so much like surrender, and was in fact the opposite. He went back to his little book. For 3 days he sat at the table with his records and his level and his drawings, and he wrote out, in plain figures exactly how much water the spring produced in a day. He had been measuring it since June, 2 barrels, give or take, depending on the heat. He wrote out how much of that water actually reached the draw before he ever touched it. Almost none, because in the dry season the thread of it had always sunk into the grass and evaporated within 50 feet of the spring's mouth. The water Pruitt claimed was flowing down to his creek had never reached the creek at all. It had been dying in the prairie sun, every drop of it, for as long as anyone had farmed that land. "He says I'm stealing water from his creek," Caleb told Margaret, tapping the page. but the spring water never got to his creek. Not in summer. It evaporated. I can prove it. I have every day's measurement since June. I can show that what I'm using is water that would otherwise be lost entirely. It never fed his land and never could. Will figures be enough? Against a lawyer? Figures and one thing more. He looked up. Witnesses. Pruitt's whole case rests on people believing the spring used to run down to his creek. But the people who farmed near it know it never did. Henrietta's been here 40 years. She knows. Others know. If enough of them say so out loud in front of the commissioner, Pruitt's lawyer has nothing but words, and my book has numbers. That was the second front of Pruitt's attack, though, and it was the crueler one. Because Pruitt held the mortgages, and a man who holds your mortgage can make it very hard for you to stand up in a public hearing and contradict him. Over the following days, as Margaret and Henrietta went quietly from farm to farm, asking neighbors to come and tell the simple truth about the spring, they met fear as often as agreement. Folks looked at their feet. Folks said they didn't want trouble. Folks said Pruitt had been good to them, extending credit, and it wouldn't do to cross him. One man, Wills, the same who'd called the system a child's whirligig, shut his door in Margaret's face. It seemed by the end of the first week of August that Pruitt had calculated correctly after all. He had built his own kind of system, and it too was a thing of patient engineering. Depth flowing downhill, fear pooling where he wanted it, every family's need channeled toward his open door. He had spent years building it. It was, in its way, the dark mirror of what Caleb had built. One man's careful design imposed on a whole valley. Margaret came home on the evening before the hearing, with 3 promises of witness and a dozen refusals, and she was bone-tired in a way the fieldwork had never made her. 3, she said, sinking onto the step. Henrietta and the Bachmans and old Lindquist. That's all. Everyone else is too afraid of him. Caleb sat beside her. The water ran in the dusk, faithful as ever, the one thing in their lives that had never once let them down. 3 honest people and a book of numbers, he said, against a lawyer and a commissioner who's already made up his mind. Yes, she turned to him. Are you afraid? He considered it honestly, the way he considered everything. I'm afraid we'll lose the spring, he said. I'm not afraid of standing up. I've been the smallest man in every room my whole life, Margaret. I learned a long time ago that the trick isn't to be the biggest. It's to be the one who's right, and to have done the work to prove it. He took her hand. We did the work. Now we find out if that's worth anything in this county. They woke before dawn to the smell of wet wood that was somehow wrong. Margaret knew it before she was fully awake. The sound of water running where water should not run. She went out in her nightdress into the gray light and stopped cold. The master flume had been broken. Not weathered, not failed. Broken. 3 of the split logs knocked from their trestles and split lengthwise, the clay joints smashed, the highest barrel tipped and emptied into the dirt. The canvas lines hung slack and cut. The whole patient system, the work of a summer, lay in ruins, and the spring's small water ran uselessly into the mud, exactly as it had the day they'd arrived. On the broken barrel, weighted with a stone, was no note. There didn't need to be one. They stood in the wreckage as the sun came up, and for a long while neither of them spoke. It was not only the destruction, it was the timing, the morning of the hearing, and the message inside the timing, which was as clear as any words could have made it. This is what waiting looks like when waiting runs out. This is what I can do, and you cannot stop me, because you are small and I am not. Margaret felt something in her give way. Not her courage exactly, but her hope. The careful, leaf-by-leaf hope she had built all summer right alongside the flumes. She looked at the smashed barrels and thought of the months of patient work, the resting between adze strokes, the waxing of canvas, the little book of numbers, and she thought, what good was any of it? He simply came in the night and broke it, the way strong men have always broken what they couldn't understand. She looked at Caleb, expecting to see in his face the same collapse she felt in her own chest. But Caleb was not looking at the wreckage. He was kneeling at the spring's mouth where the water still rose, faithful and small and entirely undamaged, because that was the one thing Pruitt could not break. The source was still giving, and Caleb was looking at it with an expression Margaret had never seen on him before. Not despair, not even anger. He was looking at it the way a man looks at the answer to a question he had been asking all along. He didn't break the spring, Caleb said quietly. He couldn't. He broke the flumes. A summer of work, yes. But the water's still here. It was always the water that mattered, not the wood. He stood, leaning on his cane, and his thin face had gone bright and certain. And he's made a mistake, Margaret. A big one. What mistake? He's destroyed everything. He's proven my whole case for me. Caleb looked toward town. He's been telling everyone the spring water belongs to his creek. And last night he came onto our land in secret and destroyed the works that use it. Why break what isn't ours to use? They did not try to rebuild that morning. There was no time, and besides, Caleb said, the ruin itself had become the most useful thing they owned. He had Margaret leave it exactly as it lay. He took out his book and, with the same care he gave the water, he wrote down everything. The position of each broken log, the cut canvas, the tipped barrel, the single boot prints in the soft mud below the spring. Prints made by a heavy man in town boots, not the worn brogans of a working farmer. Pressed deep because the man who made them carried weight. Then he sent for Henrietta, and Henrietta, who feared no one and moved faster than a woman of 70 had any right to, went and fetched the schoolmaster and the two other witnesses, and, most importantly, she went to the county seat herself in her cart, and informed the water commissioner that there had been a crime in the night, and that the hearing he was about to hold had better account for it. The hearing room was full. Word of the destruction had run through the count faster than any flume could carry water, and people who had been too afraid to take a side now came simply to see what would happen, which in a small county is nearly the same as taking one. Pruitt arrived in his good coat, his lawyer beside him with a leather case of papers, and he wore the comfortable face of a man who has already counted his winnings. He had a story ready. The Vanes had unlawfully seized water belonging to his land, and the matter was simple. The commissioner, a tired man named Ostrander, who did indeed owe Pruitt money and did indeed wish he were anywhere else, called the hearing to order and asked Pruitt's lawyer to state the claim. The lawyer stated it well. The spring fed the draw fed the creek watered Pruitt's stock. By capturing the spring, the Vanes had stolen from a prior and rightful use. He asked that the Vanes be ordered to dismantle their works and let the water run its natural course down to Pruitt's land. Then it was Caleb's turn. He did not stand at first. He let the silence stretch until every eye in the room had found the small, thin man with the cane, and then he rose, and he did not raise his voice, because he had learned long ago that a quiet voice in a loud room makes people lean in. I'd like to ask Mr. Pruitt's claim a simple question, Caleb said. He says the spring water flows down the draw to his creek, and that it's his by prior use. So I'd like to know how much water reaches his creek from my spring in the month of July. The lawyer began to answer. Caleb held up his book. I've measured it, every day since June. The spring gives about 2 barrels a day in summer, and I measured how far that water travels on its own before any man touches it. He opened the book and read the figures plainly. In July, in this heat, the spring water sinks into the ground and dries in the sun within 50 feet of where it rises. It does not reach the draw. It has never reached the draw in summer. It does not reach Mr. Pruitt's creek, and it never could, because the sun drinks it long before it gets there. I am not taking water from his creek. I am using water that was being lost entirely, every drop, to the air. Henrietta Bowl has farmed beside that spring for 40 years. She'll tell you it has never once run to the draw in a dry summer. So will the Bachmans, so will Mr. Lindqvist. And one by one, the 3 witnesses stood and said exactly that in plain words, and the room listened, because they were known to be honest and had nothing to gain. The lawyer started to recover. A clever man, he turned to argue that whether the water reached the creek or not, the principle of prior use. But Caleb was not finished. This was the part he had been building toward, the way the whole system built toward the rose. "There's one more thing the commissioner should know," he said, "and I'll let Mr. Pruitt explain it, because I confess I can't." He turned, mild as milk. "Mr. Pruitt, you've told this whole county for 2 weeks that the spring water is rightfully yours. You filed the papers saying so. Then last night someone came onto my land in the dark and destroyed every flume and barrel I'd built to use that water. Smashed all of it. Now," he spread his hands, "I'm only a slow-thinking man, but it puzzles me. If that water was rightfully yours, why would you want my works destroyed? Destroying them doesn't send the water to your creek. It just spills it in my dirt. The only person served by smashing my flumes in the night is a man who wanted me to fail at this hearing. Not a man with a true claim to the water. A man afraid of losing it." The room had gone very quiet. "I wrote down the boot prints," Caleb said, laying a page on the table before Ostrander. "Town boots, deep from a heavy man, pressed in the mud by the spring an hour before dawn. I'm not a strong man, Commissioner. Ask anyone here. I couldn't have broken those logs myself if I'd wanted to. It took a big man in good boots who could come and go in the dark and was certain no one would dare say a word against him. He let that settle. I leave it to you whose boots those are." Every eye in the room had drifted slowly and altogether to Dorsey Pruitt's feet and to the good town boots upon them, still rimmed faintly with dried gray mud. Ostrander, the tired commissioner, looked at the boots and at the book of honest figures, and at the three witnesses, and at the full room of his neighbors, all watching to see what kind of man he was. And something in him, some small ember that even debt had not quite smothered, decided that on this one day he would rather be poor and able to look at himself than rich and unable to. He dismissed Pruitt's claim entirely, and then, because the evidence of the night's work lay plain before him, he ordered Pruitt to pay the veins the full cost of every flume barrel and yard of canvas he'd destroyed. By the next summer, the slope behind the vein house was busier than any field in the county, not with one family's work, but with a dozen. Caleb sat on a stool by the spring most mornings, his cane across his knees, citing his level for whoever had come to learn, while the strongest farmers in the valley knelt in the mud and let a thin man teach them how to court water instead of fighting it. Pruitt had sold out and gone east. His big dry spread had been split among the families who'd finally stopped digging deep and started listening to the land. Margaret stood taller than her husband, as she always had. She had only ever counted it among the things she loved about being his.